Almost 14 years ago, the video game Skyrim from Bethesda Game Studios came out, which makes me feel incredibly old. This game was a monumental commercial success, and there's a reason why well over a decade later, instead of a sequel, they've simply been re-releasing the same game. Skyrim is basically the Grand Theft Auto of the fantasy genre, and The Elder Scrolls 6 is, for some people, the most anticipated game of all time. In a previous video I made, talking about the industry's search for the next Game of Thrones, I mentioned that a live-action Elder Scrolls series just might be able to achieve that status, and I thought it would be a fun idea to expand upon that concept and explain why exactly I think it could reach those heights. Now, in the interest of not repeating myself too much, I would just like to reiterate that I think styling anything off a previous project, such as attempting to make the next Game of Thrones, is a terrible idea. And in order to achieve a real success, a theoretical Elder Scrolls series would need to be its own thing. However, going forward, I will be using some examples from the Game of Thrones series to explain how I think certain elements could be adapted. That being said, here's my breakdown for what I think a live-action Elder Scrolls series could look like. In the years since its release, it's safe to say that Skyrim has stood the test of time as one of the most successful games of the late 2000s, early 2010s. This game was seen as a breakthrough for open-world games, and revolutionized much of what would go on to shape the way studios approached video game creation. Aside from the mechanics and gameplay being praised, the story and world of Skyrim quickly became a pop culture icon that many people, even those who hadn't played the games, were able to easily recognize. For this video, I decided to do some hands-on research and played it again for the first time in years. Needless to say, I was surprised to discover that the game is actually still really fun. Funnily enough, I'd never actually beaten Skyrim, despite having played it excessively as a kid. I believe I once had someone tell me that once you finish the main quest, all the side content kind of feels pointless. So in an effort to preserve my interest and enjoyment of the game, I avoided all the main story stuff. And to no one's surprise, eventually lost interest anyway, and still hadn't finished it. One of the reasons why Skyrim was, and to an extent still is, so appealing is because of the vast world they let you explore, and the rich content that is hiding around every corner. Most of the quests in this game are super memorable, and the different guilds and plotlines you can experience have offered some of the greatest moments available in an open world fantasy adventure. The possibilities are endless, and despite the joke that everybody who plays Skyrim inevitably ends up as a stealth archer, no two playthroughs are the same. Despite other successful series like Fallout, and other less successful series, The Elder Scrolls was always my favorite world from Bethesda, due to its commitment to high fantasy and rich world building. For this video, I spent quite a bit of time researching the lore behind the world of Tamriel, and coming from someone who's read the Silmarillion multiple times for fun, I found myself intimidated by the sheer scope of the Elder Scrolls Legendarium, as well as an immense respect for the dedication shown by the team at Bethesda for crafting an incredibly complex and over-the-top idea for a video game. I do believe that the sheer depth of the universe is what led to the massive success of Skyrim. Whether the casual gamer cares enough to read even a single in-game history book, or pay attention when the game talks about the Aldmeri Dominion or the Thalmor, I don't think that really matters, because the audience can feel the depth of the world, whether or not they take the time to truly understand it. I've held this as a personal belief for a while now, that when love, care, and attention are put into projects, the payoff will always be greater. And because of how much depth there is to the world of Elder Scrolls, that's why I think it would be fantastic to see it translated into a television series. For years, it had been universally accepted that video games should never be translated into movies or TV shows. Over 30 straight years of horrible adaptations had led fans to mistrust any video game movie, and almost never advocate for the creation thereof. However, in the last couple of years, we've started to finally see studios get a grasp on how to make a successful, and more impressively, cool and interesting video game adaptations, and they are far from finished making them. Bethesda themselves are in the process of releasing their own TV show, based on their other popular franchise, Fallout. This show seems at least somewhat promising so far, but only time will tell if it'll actually be a good adaptation. Some fans have complained about some of the classic Fallout flavor seemingly missing from the trailers, but until it comes out, we will have nothing but speculation to go off. I will state that my entire pitch and desire for an Elder Scrolls series does pretty much depend on the success of Fallout. Because if they can't get that right, then I'd rather they'd stay away from making more bad shows just for the sake of content. Skyrim, much like Fallout, is an open world game where the main character serves as a vessel for the player. and any subsequent actions made are entirely dependent on how the player chooses to approach the content. This does make an adaptation difficult, as a definitive main character would be needed to tie it all together. And while I do plan on explaining my ideas for that in a later part, I do think that Skyrim benefits from plenty of interesting characters that the story can use to progress smoothly. Adapting any story into film and television can be a difficult, daunting task, and especially when you are given content that doesn't have a lot of canonical answers to the in-universe story questions, that can make things tricky. I mentioned in a previous video that the Elder Scrolls universe would give the creators opportunity to experiment around, directly after I stated that writers needed to focus on making faithful adaptations. So I'd like to explain a little bit what I meant by that. In a game like Skyrim, there are plenty of areas to explore, and the content of the show is almost entirely dependent on the showrunners. If they decided to forego the main plot altogether and make a series entirely about the Thieves Guild or the College of Winterhold, they could. Many major characters such as Jarl Balgruuf or Ulfric Stormcloak are incredibly interesting characters, but are extremely open-ended. So adding bits to their background or making them go and do things they never did wouldn't be viewed as such sacrilege as if you took, say, Aragorn from The Lord of the Rings and said, nah, actually, he was the one who took the ring into Mordor. Of course, there are things you need to stay true to in an adaptation, but I do feel like The Elder Scrolls offers a certain safety net for experimentation that other properties don't. Now, in order to make some of those changes, the showrunners would first need to prove that they understand, and what's more important, respect the lore that they are adapting. Only then will they earn the trust required to start tweaking story elements without the risk of major backlash. As I stated, my few hours into the Elder Scrolls lore was daunting. So, in order to adapt this correctly, they'll need to do their homework and assemble a team of knowledgeable and passionate writers. It seems like nowadays, film industries tend to lean away from writers and actors who know a lot about the work they're involved in, when it should be the complete opposite. If studios really want to get a massive hit, then they need to listen to the story they are adapting and understand that, hey, guess what? It was massive and popular for a reason. You don't need to completely alter it in order for it to work. If done correctly, an Elder Scrolls adaptation won't have to try to be the next Game of Thrones. Instead, they should want future shows to say, hey, how can we make the next Elder Scrolls? So throughout this video, you've heard me jump between referring to Skyrim and the Elder Scrolls interchangeably. And that's because, while I think that if a TV show were created, it would offer much more freedom to call itself the Elder Scrolls and have access to stories all across Tamriel. However, I think the first couple seasons at least should be focused on the Skyrim conflict. Now, this does add some challenges, because while Skyrim is the most mainstream and popular sector of the franchise, it's also the latest event canonically. So if they moved into other stories afterwards, they'd either have to break major canon, create entirely new stories, or jump back in time. A safe bet could just be to call the first series Skyrim, and then maybe have a spin-off show in the future for Oblivion and Morrowind, but that's not a decision I have to make. For the story of Skyrim, it can essentially be broken down into two major plotlines, that being the return of Alduin and the Dragonborn, and the conflict of the Skyrim Civil War. There are many ways you could approach this, by maybe focusing on one storyline for the first season and one for the second, but for my pitch, I think they should both run parallel to each other. There are also four minor storylines of the different guilds, those being the Companions, Thieves Guild, College of Winterhold, and the Dark Brotherhood. Now, for some of these storylines, I think they can be woven into the narrative fairly easy, especially with a guild like the Companions based out of the city of Whiterun, which, for my concept, would be where the story is mainly centered on. In my pitch of what a live-action Skyrim could look like, I envision the Jarl and his family in Whiterun serving as our key characters of the story, and would at least be the characters we start our story with. To begin with the Game of Thrones comparisons, Thrones receives endless praise for its ability to masterfully weave complex plots together and have an expansive and diverse story being told. But the secret to how they accomplish this? Episode 1 begins in Winterfell, with the Starks serving as our main characters. And as the series progresses, we are mostly only introduced to new storylines as a result of our main cast interacting with them. And as the series continues to sprawl and we find our main cast far from the original boundaries of Winterfell, it isn't a daunting task to understand what's going on, because we've been fed new characters and plot lines naturally. This is how I would tackle the world of Skyrim, by starting out with Jarl Balgruuf's family as the centerpiece and moving forward from there. I talked about making changes, and the first major change would be tweaking the Jarl's family. Aging up his children and making them more influential parts of the story would help with the natural story progression. In my pitch, the main characters within Whiterun would be Jarl Balgruuf as the lead, his children, Frothar, Dagny, and Nelkir, his steward, Proventus Avenici, court wizard Farengar, housecarl Lydia, and Janasa, the Ranger for Hire. While I think there would be other important characters to the story, such as Ulfric Stormcloak and the Greybeards, I think that this initial cast can access most of the plot through their storylines. For example, the steward Proventus Avenici could have some ties to the Thieves Guild, and uses this leverage to gather information essential for the prosperity of Whiterun. One of Balgruuf's children could be studying under the court wizard, aspiring to leave and train at the College of Winterhold, while the other seeks to join the Companions Guild. Balgruuf himself serves as an excellent tie-in to the Skyrim Civil War, as his doubts surrounding the conflicts plays a major part in the game, and the Battle of Whiterun itself is a massive part of the story. I sort of had this idea for how Whiterun could be dragged into the Civil War and involve the Dark Brotherhood at the same time. In my idea, the Jarl of Whiterun and the Jarl of Winterhold decide to do a trade, and they offer to train each other's children. One of Jarl Balgruuf's kids gets to study at the College of Winterhold, just like they've always wanted, and Jarl Courier could send his son Asser to train with the Companions Guild. The inciting incident would be when Ulfric Stormcloak hires a Dark Brotherhood assassin to kill one of Jarl Balgruuf's children, and in an unfortunate mix-up, ends up accidentally killing the Jarl of Winterhold's son. This would put the two kingdoms at odds, dragging them both into the war. And in my version, they'd both be previously undeclared. And it would add a lot of tension having one of the main characters stuck in a city that has now declared war against their father. I do know this is sort of dipping into Game of Thrones territory, but I think it's a good plot device that adds a lot of tension. To address the looming questions around the Skyrim Civil War, since in the game, the outcome is entirely dependent on the player character, I'm just going to go ahead and say that the Imperials are going to come out on top for the most part. And I'm sure the Return of the Dragons is going to cause some disruptions to the war, but we'll talk about that in a second. When I was a kid, I chose to side with the Stormcloaks, because the only thing I understood was that they weren't the ones who tried to kill me at the start of the game. And if I'm being honest, I did not pay attention to any of the reasoning surrounding the war. I just liked blue better than red. But now looking at it again as an adult, the Stormcloaks just straight up suck. While there are a lot of morally gray aspects of the Civil War, and is part of what would make it so interesting to adapt, the Stormcloaks are basically just fantasy Nazis. I mean, sure, they structure their cause over wanting to stop the Imperials from taking control of the independent Skyrim. And again, as a kid, Empire bad, Rebels good. But at their heart, they are the most racist and hateful faction of the game. So, sorry, the Stormcloaks will not be conquering Whiterun in my pitch. On to the other major half of the story, which is monumentally more important than the Skyrim Civil War, and makes up the entire main quest of the game, is the resurgence of the dragons, an ancient race thought to be extinct. This occurs at the same time that a dragonborn appears, a human with the soul of a dragon, who can use an ancient magic system known as shouting, and can also absorb the souls of the dragons. Now this is where the adaptation gets sticky, because, like I mentioned before, this is the player character, so adapting it into a singular character could be difficult. But I do have a few ideas of how this can be achieved, and it really does boil down to two options, which is you can either have a character made for the Dragonborn, or have one of the pre-established main characters revealed to be the Dragonborn in a shocking twist. While I do like the idea of a huge reveal where you discover the identity of the Dragonborn, I also hate the idea that the show might dangle the reveal over your head for the entire season. Sort of like how Rings of Power was constantly hinting at who the real Sauron was supposed to be. So if I actually had to make that decision, I think I would have the Dragonborn be their own character and be introduced at the end of the first episode, though not yet fully aware of who they are. This is where the last of Jarl Balgruuf's children would fit into my concept, and I would have one of them tag along to Helgen to witness the impending execution of Ulfric Stormcloak, which would be a major topic of conversation among the citizens in the first episode. Instead of starting out the series with the iconic cart ride to the execution, I would have that be the ending, with the dragon attack being the big moment of the pilot episode. To lean into the secrecy a little bit, I would show the band of prisoners being let off with Ulfric, but not until the conflict is resolved would you learn which of the characters the Dragonborn is meant to be. Balgruuf's child who attended the execution would flee the disaster with the aid of the Dragonborn, and would serve as the one who first brings them to Whiterun and introduces them to the Jarl. I think that the first season, which In my current pitch, I think the story should be split into two parts. It should focus more heavily on the Civil War as a driving part of the story. And in my pitch, the Season 1 finale would culminate with the Battle of Whiterun, and the iconic climb up the 7,000 steps to High Hrothgar, where the Dragonborn would meet the Greybeards for the first time. I also think that pairing up one of Jarl Balgruuf's children with the Dragonborn will not only help them feel more connected to the plot, but serve as someone for the actor to bounce off of instead of just walking alone in the wilderness going on random quests. Most of my playthroughs in Skyrim involved a companion anyway, so I don't think this is a bad addition at all. Now, to cover the last real story points, and I just want to be clear, I'm not intending to do a full episode by episode pitch with a well-written script and everything. I'm not getting paid to do that much work. But I would just like to say that the storylines of the 4 main guilds you can join are all incredibly interesting stories in their own right. While I do like the idea of having one of Jarl Balgruuf's children in the College of Winterhold, one of them in the Companions, and one accompanying the Dragonborn, I don't think that the Dark Brotherhood and the Thieves Guild would need a direct character tie-in. And once they have their first appearance, the show can slowly start to unravel the intricacies of what is going on in each storyline. I personally think the Dark Brotherhood's assassination of the High King of Tamriel would be a crazy thing to see unfold. This is also another huge area where playing around with the source material would be encouraged. In most of the guild questlines, your character basically does everything, with the other members of the guild often lending a hand, but mostly being useless when compared to the Dragonborn's sheer ability to handle business. And yes, for this series, the Dragonborn would not align with any guild or side in the Civil War. Being the Dragonborn is enough of a responsibility itself. So certain characters within the guilds would need to be fleshed out more, and delegated certain key moments to carry out. I also wouldn't be opposed to some guilds like the Companions finishing their storyline in Season 1. It might be a little too much if 6 major plotlines are all converging and finishing at the same time. But that leads me into my next point, which is adapting the finale. It would be incredibly lame if all the guilds resolved their storylines and then completely dipped from the show with a handful of episodes still to go. So you would have to find a way for the guilds to interact with the story in a meaningful way. For some of these, it isn't so hard to figure out. The College of Winterhold and the Companions Guild can both enter the Civil War fighting for their respective cities, and be involved in the last major conflict. I do envision the final fight with Alduin and some sort of last major conflict of the Civil War being fought simultaneously, perhaps with some overlap like dragons spilling out of Sovngarde and whatnot. But other storylines like the Dark Brotherhood and the Thieves Guild would be trickier to tie in. Luckily, I don't actually have to figure that out. In all honesty, I think the possibility of us getting an Elder Scrolls series at some point is probably pretty high. With how desperately Hollywood has been combing through every creative IP, it sometimes feels like there isn't a single thing we won't see adapted, sequeled, or rebooted within our lifetime. But the mere fact that the Fallout series is a real thing that is actually coming out certainly points in the direction that other Bethesda works could be next. I think a lot of it depends on how that series does. If it's a success, then I would hardly be surprised if an Elder Scrolls series is announced next. There have been rumors about such a concept for years, but only time will tell if it actually happens. If done right, an Elder Scrolls TV series could be one of the greatest things we've seen on screen in a long time. And with studios constantly wanting to capture that spark of Game of Thrones, Skyrim offers everything you could want in that. With political unrest, weaving subplots, and major spectacles, the rich world of the Elder Scrolls already stands as one of the most beloved in gaming pop culture. And with the correct execution, it could rise to even greater heights.